a 15th century diplomat, a man whose brilliance in strategy shaped the world, the author of The Prince, the ultimate observer of power. And yet, Niccolò Machiavelli spent his final years utterly undone, not by armies, not by kings, but by women, hundreds of them. And what he discovered in those private encounters about men, desire, and weakness became the most hidden lesson in all of his work. Almost nobody talks about this. Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel dives into the raw psychology of power, influence, and human behavior. Today, we're stepping into territory almost every history or psychology channel avoids: the private, messy, and unflinching truth about Machiavelli, not as a strategist or philosopher, but as a man. By the end of this, you'll see male psychology and yourself through a completely different lens. Who was Machiavelli, really? Most people think they know Machiavelli, the prince, cold, calculating, ruthless, the textbook image of a man who would betray anyone to gain power. But that version is only half the story. Machiavelli, the man, was far more complex and far more human than his reputation suggests. For most of his adult life, Niccolò Machiavelli held genuine power. He was a senior diplomat for the Florentine Republic, navigating the treacherous politics of Renaissance Italy. He traveled across Europe, meeting kings, popes, and military leaders. He negotiated treaties, observed armies, and recorded every interaction with meticulous care. He was a student of power in the rawest, most practical sense. Machiavelli had an insatiable curiosity. He studied the greats, Julius Caesar, Hannibal, Cesare Borgia, the rulers and generals who shaped history through brilliance and brutality. But he wasn't just interested in their victories. He wanted to know why the most powerful men, those with entire armies in their hands, those commanding nations, sometimes destroyed themselves completely. The answer, he observed repeatedly, wasn't betrayal by rivals, bad luck, or poor strategy. It was desire. Specifically, a man's inability to master his own hunger for women. He watched men lose focus, make catastrophic errors, and compromise everything they had worked for, not because of enemies outside, but because of weaknesses within. And here's the irony: the man who could analyze this flaw better than anyone could not escape it himself. Despite years of studying it, he was not immune. Desire, as he would come to understand it, was a force no strategy, no intellect could fully contain. Machiavelli's insights were reflected not only in The Prince, but also in his discourses and his personal letters. He identified patterns in male behavior that went beyond morality, beyond ethics, beyond judgment, patterns rooted in biology, psychology, and human nature itself. Men could plan, negotiate, and strategize with extraordinary precision, and yet, under the right conditions, they would betray their own reason, their own dignity, for desire. This pattern wasn't random. Machiavelli could predict it. He noticed that men who seemed unshakable, disciplined, or cunning during the day could be rendered almost irrational at night when confronted with sexual desire. He saw men prioritize admiration over reality, sensation over strategy, approval over their own power. And in observing this, he began to see the underlying mechanisms of power, not just how to gain it, but how it could slip away faster than anyone imagined. In essence, Machiavelli's genius wasn't only that he understood how to acquire power, it was that he understood the subtle, often invisible ways power could be undone. The failures of the most powerful men were not random, they were predictable. And almost always, they traced back to desire, the blind spots, the weaknesses, and the vulnerabilities men carry within themselves, no matter how disciplined, no matter how intelligent. Yet, despite his brilliance, Machiavelli's own life would become a testament to the same vulnerabilities he observed. The man who wrote the definitive guide on acquiring and maintaining power would spend his later years struggling with the very flaws he studied. Understanding them was one thing, living free from them was another. And it is precisely this tension between knowledge and practice that makes his life and his observations about male psychology so compelling and instructive. By studying him, we don't just study history or strategy, we study the mechanics of human desire, the invisible pressures that shape decisions, and the reasons men, even the most powerful, can be undone by forces they can see but cannot control. Machiavelli's life teaches us that intellect alone is not enough. Awareness is not freedom, strategy is not immunity, and the moment desire enters the equation, all bets are off. The Fall and Secret Life. In 1512, Machiavelli's life took a devastating turn. The Medici family returned to power in Florence, and with them came retribution. Machiavelli was stripped of his office, arrested, and tortured. Though eventually released, he was exiled to a small farm outside the city. At 43, he had lost everything: his position, his influence, his reputation. He had a wife, children, and debts, but no purpose beyond the walls of his modest home. It was during this exile that he produced some of his most enduring works: The Prince, the Discourses, letters filled with political insight. But alongside these masterpieces, Machiavelli kept a private chronicle, one that few historians fully appreciate. In letters to his friend Francesco Vettori, he described a side of his life entirely hidden from the public eye. Evenings spent in inns and brothels, encounters with women whose names and faces he recorded with frank honesty. These letters reveal a man both fascinated and humiliated. He would go out at night, seeking pleasure or companionship, and often return to his desk to write about the nature of power, strategy, and human behavior. The duality is striking: a brilliant strategist capable of dissecting the strengths and weaknesses of kings, yet completely vulnerable to desires he could clearly identify. He saw himself being manipulated, laughed at, and yet could not resist. It was as if he had become both the observer and the subject of the most revealing social experiment. In one letter, he recounts an encounter with a woman at an inn. He details her charm, her cunning, and even the subtle ways she controlled the situation. And then, almost laughing at himself, he admits he willingly walked into the trap, fully aware of the consequences. Knowing a weakness and escaping it are two different things. The lesson here is profound. Insight alone cannot protect a man from the impulses that live inside him. Machiavelli's observations went beyond shame or guilt. They were methodical. He watched the patterns of his own behavior, dissected them, and recorded them with scientific detachment. Every humiliation, every manipulation became data. Yet even this disciplined self-analysis could not free him from the pull of desire. What makes this period so fascinating is the contrast between his intellectual prowess and his personal vulnerability. Here was a man who could negotiate with popes, advise princes, and analyze the collapse of empires, yet he could not control his own private compulsions. The very weaknesses he had catalogued in history's greatest men were now his own. This duality, master of strategy, victim of desire, provides one of the most striking psychological lessons in history. Machiavelli's genius lay not just in understanding power in the abstract, but in seeing how human nature undermines it from within. His exile years show us the raw mechanics of desire, the ways in which even the most disciplined mind can be distracted, manipulated, and undone. By observing himself in these private moments, Machiavelli became his own case study. He could describe the forces at work, recognize the triggers, and understand the consequences, but recognition did not equal mastery. The man who could see the weaknesses of kings and generals could not fully master his own. And it is in this struggle, in this gap between insight and action, that Machiavelli reveals one of the most uncomfortable truths about male psychology. Knowing your weakness is only the first step. Overcoming it is an entirely different challenge. His exile, then, was not only a fall from political power, it was a mirror. It reflected the vulnerabilities inherent in every man who mistakes intellect for control and observation for immunity. And in this reflection, Machiavelli would confront a truth few men ever do. The deeper the understanding of desire, the sharper the awareness of one's own inability to resist it. Machiavelli's observation of male psychology. Machiavelli's private struggles weren't just personal, they were part of a pattern he had seen over and over in his career. Powerful men, men who commanded armies and negotiated with kings, often destroyed themselves in ways that had nothing to do with enemies or strategy. Machiavelli called it a blind spot, one that every man carries, the influence of desire on judgment, reason, and self-control. He noticed what we might now call the desire blind spot. When a man's sexual desire is triggered, his reasoning diminishes. The part of the brain responsible for foresight, risk assessment, and long-term thinking, the prefrontal cortex, loses dominance. In its place, the limbic system, the ancient emotional and survival-focused center, takes over. Suddenly, even the most disciplined men act impulsively, chase illusions, and betray their own interests. It's not weakness, it's biology. But biology becomes dangerous when it interacts with ambition and power. Machiavelli saw this every day. Men who were brilliant strategists in the morning could make catastrophic errors by nightfall, all because desire had clouded their judgment. He observed rulers trust the wrong advisors, make reckless promises, and risk everything, all for a fleeting sense of validation or pleasure. Desire, he concluded, is information, and it reveals more about a man than any battlefield or treaty ever could. What makes this insight so profound is that Machiavelli connected biology with strategy. He realized that the men most vulnerable to this blind spot were not weak men. They were strong, ambitious, disciplined, and intelligent men. The very qualities that allowed them to dominate in politics, war, and commerce made them more susceptible to the subtle manipulations of desire. And those who understood this, often the women in inns and brothels he observed, had a practical advantage over the seemingly invincible. These women, Machiavelli noted, were natural psychologists. Their survival depended on understanding male desire with precision. They knew which words, gestures, and attitudes would trigger vulnerability. They could manipulate desire not out of malice, but out of necessity, turning it into a currency of influence. And Machiavelli, ever the observer, watched this interplay with fascination and frustration. He saw the mechanics in real time. Men would exaggerate status, seek validation, and make errors that would have been unthinkable without desire clouding judgment. Machiavelli's genius lay in seeing that this blind spot was predictable. Desire was not chaotic, it followed patterns. External influence, miscalculated risks, and emotional surrender could all be anticipated if one understood the human psyche. But while he could study it scientifically, he could not escape it personally. He became both the experimenter and the subject. This period reveals one of the most uncomfortable truths about male psychology. Desire does not simply distract, it hijacks. It exposes insecurities, amplifies weaknesses, and can undo decades of careful planning. Even a man who writes the definitive manual on power cannot fully protect himself from it. Knowledge and control are not the same. Insight, while powerful, does not grant immunity. And yet, Machiavelli's observations were not moral judgments. He didn't label men weak or women manipulative in a negative sense. He treated the human experience as a system to be studied: cause, effect, consequence. This detached curiosity is what allowed him to see the subtle mechanisms of power, desire, and vulnerability more clearly than almost anyone before or since. Ultimately, Machiavelli's observation of male psychology shows us that the most dangerous adversary a man faces is not an external enemy, it is the internal force of desire. It can undo strategy, compromise judgment, and even dismantle dignity. And in understanding this, we are left with the paradox Machiavelli himself faced. The clearer we see the weakness, the more painfully aware we are of our own susceptibility to it. The three core weaknesses. Machiavelli didn't just observe desire in passing, he broke it down into patterns. Over decades of diplomacy, exile, and personal reflection, he identified three core weaknesses that consistently undermined men, no matter their intelligence, discipline, or power. These are not moral failings, they are psychological vulnerabilities, predictable and universal. Understanding them is key to understanding both history and human behavior. Weakness number 1. The need for validation from women. Even the most powerful men, Machiavelli noted, could be softened by the need for admiration. A glance, a compliment, a fleeting smile from a woman they desired could override years of strategy and discipline. He watched men exaggerate wealth, lie about accomplishments, or make promises they could not keep, simply to secure approval. Modern psychology calls this an external locus of control. When a man's sense of self-worth depends on someone else, he hands them power over his internal state. In practical terms, this means a man's emotional stability can be manipulated without coercion. Machiavelli observed it in rulers, generals, and merchants alike. The moment a man seeks validation, he becomes vulnerable. Step 2 is understand what you're really seeking. Desire is rarely about the surface object. When Machiavelli sought women in exile, he wasn't pursuing the women themselves, he was seeking significance, attention, and a temporary sense of power. Desire points to deeper unmet needs, validation, meaning, or relief from the weight of responsibility. The moment you can identify the true source of your craving, the external object loses its power over you. Address the underlying need, and the compulsion begins to weaken. Step 3 is build identity from the inside. The reason powerful men are vulnerable to this pattern is because their sense of self is tied to external validation. Position, status, and public admiration become the foundation of identity. When those trappings fall away through failure, exile, or rejection, there is nothing beneath. The man who cultivates internal foundations, values, skill, craft, and self-knowledge remains intact no matter what external forces shift. This is the armor Machiavelli himself never fully built, despite recognizing its necessity. Machiavelli's final years on that small farm illustrate the ultimate lesson. Desire itself isn't the enemy. The danger lies in unconscious desire. Without self-awareness, desire becomes a leash, and someone, anyone, can hold the other end. By contrast, awareness and deliberate reflection allow a man to observe desire without being controlled by it, to act rather than react, to choose rather than surrender. His life is not a cautionary tale about failure. It's a cautionary tale about the gap between insight and embodiment, between understanding and living according to that understanding. Even the greatest strategist, the man who dissected the mechanics of power and influence, struggled when the force he studied became personal. That is the reality of human psychology. Knowing a weakness is only the first step. Mastering it is the lifelong challenge. So ask yourself, who is in control of your choices? Are your actions dictated by awareness or by impulses you've ignored? Desire, external validation, and the need for surrender will always exist, but they do not have to define you. Machiavelli's story shows that the same forces that toppled kings, generals, and rulers operate in every life. The difference lies in conscious observation, honest self-assessment, and deliberate cultivation of inner strength. Take this lesson beyond history. Observe your impulses, identify your hidden needs, build your identity from within. Only then do you gain the freedom Machiavelli sought but never fully achieved. His writings, his failures, and his insights remain a guide. The most dangerous battles are not fought on the battlefield. They are fought inside your own mind.